All right, so one of the first things that we need to discuss is what exactly are models? So a model simply provides a framework mental processes work or interact with other factors of the environment. Something to remember is in order to illustrate this relationship, what we want to do is provide a model so we can have a framework or basic understanding of how this interaction here works. Now, interestingly, something to recall and something to keep in mind is that a framework can change and may be different in each subfield. So for instance, some of you that might have taken introductory psychology, remember that there's multiple fields that are involved in that main field of psychology as a science. For example, we have clinical psychology, forensic psychology. So keep in mind that frameworks are used to define and explain more complex topics. And these topics, of course, can change based on the subfield. Also, it can vary amongst different subfields or different areas of study. So let's think about social work. Let's think about sociology. So fields that are related to the social sciences, keep in mind that the frameworks that they use to explain their own processes can also vary in each subfield. Now, the main goal of a model is to provide us an understanding of how multiple factors come into play in order to explain behavior, right? So some individuals like to think about they are exposed to a serial killer, right? And they will hear a documentary about a serial killer, and they would say something like, well, it was something about his childhood, or his or her childhood, or it was something about maybe they had a TBI, a traumatic brain injury. But keep in mind that in this case, there were multiple factors that more than likely contributed to that person's behavior, i.e., for example, of killing. So a model can help us understand what factors came into play in order for this person to have said behavior. So generally, we will have a variety of factors that we can use through a model to explain that complexity. Now, what are the models that we can utilize? Perhaps this is a model that you might have seen before, a model that you might have been exposed to, particularly early on in your field, is a Venn diagram. Basically, a Venn diagram is simply a circle, right? A variety of circles that will turn into sets. Notice that there will be some overlap in these circles. So you will have more than likely an overlap, and this overlap will be used to explain these relationships. So notice that here you will have an overlap. You have an overlap between these two circles, and you have an overlap of these two circles, and so on and so forth. Now, interestingly, we can have specific areas that are considered subsets. So for example, we can have a smaller area, and also we can have a larger area. Now, generally, we think about these as characteristics. Now, a great example of this type of Venn diagram, let's think about anxiety or panic disorders. So in this case, notice that we have greater sets. So for instance, we have a panic disorder at the top. We have a panic disorder at the top. We also have an anxiety disorder and obsessive compulsive disorders. So these are the ones that are represented in the larger subsets, as illustrated here. Interestingly, notice how we also have subsets of each disorder. And notice how we will have characteristics of its symptoms. So let's take a look at our first example. So we have anxiety disorder. In anxiety disorder, we may be exposed to catastrophizing. And we may also have difficulty concentrating, as well as other symptoms, as shown here. But keep in mind, if you've been following closely, notice that difficulty concentrating does not solely pertain to an anxiety disorder, right? Because here, difficulty concentrating has an overlap characteristic right here when it comes to obsessive compulsive disorder. What I mean is that, for example, one symptom of a specific mental illness does not necessarily only apply to that mental illness. This is why a Venn diagram would be immensely useful in the sense of us illustrating that overlap between the supersets and the subsets. Interestingly, if we keep looking at those symptoms or characteristics, notice that right now we have only been focusing on the Venn diagram that talks about mental illness, right? So we have these three right here. But notice that interestingly, these symptoms, so for example, a tight chest, not being able to breathe, having fatigue and fear, are also early symptoms of COVID. So notice that just because there is a subset, in this case, there is a subset that pertains to the Venn diagram, we may also have completely separate aspects that are not even related to the Venn diagram in the first place, because we strictly been talking about these three anxiety-related disorders, but COVID, of course, is not an anxiety disorder, but yet it does share characteristics with the rest of these three anxiety disorders. So interpretation of these Venn diagrams, even though it looks simple enough, we need to remember that in this particular case, we may have a specific overlap between and within the illustrations that you're wanting to portray in that Venn diagram, but also keep in mind that you may have a different relationship and a seemingly good relationship with symptoms, but notice that COVID is absolutely not related, particularly with this model that we're trying to illustrate. Now, this is a more complex Venn diagram. And what do I mean? So notice that here we're talking about psychoactive drugs, right? And we have within that larger set, within this larger set, so for example, we have stimulants illustrated in yellow, and we have depressants illustrated in green. Notice that within that superset, we also have other characteristics. We have other subsets that in and by themselves, relatively larger. So notice how within the stimulant psychoactive drugs, we also have psychomotor stimulants. This is particularly useful to illustrate when we have a large subset. We have a large subset of a category, but then we also have categories within that category. So for example, in the main category, I should say, we have stimulants. If we add one bullet, it would be psychomotor stimulants. And then within that, we have amphetamines. So notice how each one of these had a subset. This was particularly different from the much simpler model that we were illustrating before, which had no major subsets. This case, however, we are seeing a more complex set of, for example, stimulants. Now, for instance, let's go into sedatives, which is illustrated in the major set of depressants. If you notice, we have the depressants. Within it, we have the sedatives. And within the sedatives, we also have minor tranquilizers, as illustrated here. So notice how every minor tranquilizer, i.e. Xanax, is a depressant in the greater scheme of things. So the minor tranquilizer of Xanax, it's considered a depressant. But not all depressants are minor tranquilizers or Xanax. That is because there is a specific subset, right? There's a specific subset for each of these depressants. Now, something else that we can think of is another method to illustrate a model. In this case, we would like to illustrate a basic process through a flowchart. Generally, in this specific case, the first thing that we like to do in a flowchart, as illustrated at the top, is that within a flowchart, we generally utilize linear stages. Using linear stages are particularly good for illustrating a sequence. Right? So for example, going from one particular symptom, moving up to, this could be a sequence for a mood disorder, which could in turn relate to a diagnosis later on. So notice how there is a linear sequence from here to here. Want to illustrate how that sequence or that process, I should say, occurred. Another interesting characteristic, I should say, is that these arrows that you see here in a flowchart can be either unidirectional, so the flow will only go from one direction to the other, or bidirectional, which means it can go from one to the other. So a unidirectional arrow illustrates that A must occur before B. So that's a very simple explanation of a unidirectional arrow. However, in the bidirectional sense of things, in the bidirectional arrow, it could go either way. So for example, B can go to A, right? So we can have B to A, we can have A to B. We can also have B to C and C to D, but we cannot have C and then A, because there was a step, there was a process that had to occur in the middle. Another interesting factor is the way that we draw the lines. So for example, if we draw a very solid line, means that there is a direct relationship between one factor and the second factor. So that's what a solid line represents. However, if we have a dashed line, this dashed line, when we are illustrating a flow chart, it may represent an indirect relationship or a weaker relationship between one matter and the next matter. Another thing to note is that generally, we will find that that middle box, it's generally an intermediate step or a variable that could be doing an intervention between factor 1 and factor 2, factor 3. So box number 2, as illustrated here, could have an intermediate state between 1 and 2. Now, generally, when we think about anger, we may think that anger is a snappy event, right? We generally try to think about anger as something that occurs with no steps. It occurs immediately from 0 to 100, and generally that's what it feels like. For those of you who are going to go into practice, you will see that that's actually not the case. Part of your job is identifying that middle step intermediate factor in order to manage anger. Having said that, how do we know that? Well, we have this model, right? We have a model to illustrate that flow between frustration and aggression. So notice, if we take a look at our slide, notice that in this case, you have frustration as the first element. You have frustration as the first element. So notice that here you will have frustration, which can later lead to anger, which can later lead to aggression. That is not to say, if you remember what I explained about unidirectional and bidirectional flow within these boxes, that doesn't mean that all types of frustration are going to lead to anger, and it doesn't mean that all forms of anger can lead to aggression. So let's think about an example. Notice that in frustration, we may say, well, it can always lead to anger. Well, think about this. Think about the last time you either witnessed or experienced yourself partner disagreement, right? So this is our first box, partner disagreement. it may or may not have led for you to be upset. You might have felt sad, right? So this is a completely different flow. This is a completely different flow than thinking about being upset. Because not all frustration can lead to anger. Now, something important to note is that frustration does not, even though it occurred and preceded anger, right? It occurred before anger. It doesn't necessarily mean that it caused anger, right? Frustration doesn't necessarily mean that it caused anger. There's multiple factors that involve anger. So for example, types of chemicals in your brain. How have you learned to deal with your anger? Types of experiences that you have with your anger, other emotions, means and capability to express this anger, whether it be in a healthy or unhealthy way. So notice the frustration here is not the sole cause of anger. So this is a really interesting way to explain the frustration and anger relationship, or hypotheses, I should say. So let's continue on with our illustrated example here. So we have partner disagreement. Here, we may start feeling upset. This is our second box, our second factor, which can in turn lead us into an aggressive behavior, so perhaps throwing an object at each other. But I need to remind you that not all frustration leads to anger, just like not always anger will lead to aggression. Just like in this case here, partner disagreement could lead to being upset, but it can also lead to feeling sad. And it doesn't necessarily mean because you're sad, you would throw an object. Perhaps the behavior that we have here is crying. So notice that it's not necessarily a causal relationship. One doesn't necessarily cause the other, but it's a good way to illustrate how one factor can lead to the next. Now, here is another factor that I like to talk about when it comes to flow charts. Remember, if you recall from previous lectures, in the behaviorist side of things, in the behaviorist model, they are simply concerned with what can be observed. So for instance, if we think about anger, as we just talked about earlier, people would say, well, I can see anger, right? I can see how my spouse was angry, or my partner. I can see if the professor is angry. But can you really see anger? Can you really tell me what color anger is? Can you really tell me how much does anger weigh? So because it is not directly observable, a behaviorist would argue we should only study whatever we can see directly, whatever is an external behavior. So I can't see anger necessarily, but I can see someone throwing an object at somebody else. So that's a behavior. So that's where we draw that inference of going back and saying, well, a person who's angry may throw an object towards somebody else. Now, in the cognitive side of things, notice that a cognitive individual would say, well, clearly there's another process involved in anger that we cannot see. And they would argue that this can be scientifically studied. And generally, this will involve an internal behavior, right? An internal process. So let's look at the differences here and in both models. So we have model number 1 and model number 2. That is going to help us understand behavior and cognition. So notice that in the behavior side of things, we receive a stimulus, and they argue that because we can't see that internal process, we simply cannot study it. So we go from stimulus directly to that response. They argue in this flow, we have this factor, and this factor, this factor, from stimulus to response, because simply this box here is a black box. We cannot study it. On the other hand, in our second model here, cognitive individuals would say, well, we're going to receive an input from the environment. Think about your partner yelling. A cognitive scientist would argue, well, there isn't such thing as a black box. There is indeed a process that will mediate our understanding of this input versus our output. That's generally what we would consider a mental event. So this box is indeed not a black box. It's not an unknown or not observable. We can indeed study it. We can infer, say, for example, through an assessment, we can say, I don't know what anger looks like, right? I can tell you what color it is. I can tell you the weight. I can tell you how tall it is. But through a mental event, that mental process, I should say, we're going to move from this input to that factor, that process that's going to mediate between that input and later on my output, which my output in this case would be the behavior. So very similar to the example that I illustrated earlier about partner disagreement, becoming upset, and later throwing an object. Notice how the input came from the environment, i.e. partner disagreement. And then the output was a behavior, and a behavior would be throwing an object. Now let's go to our third model to explain complex information. Now here, we're going to talk about our third model, which is, or type of model, I should say, which is a vertical hierarchy. Now, what's the main point of this model? What makes it unique between the other ones? So in our first model in the Venn diagram, what makes it unique is that we can separate categories, but we can also see how these categories may have some subsets, I should say, together. Pardon me 1 second with the microphone. Perfect. Now, as I was saying, Venn diagram, what makes it unique is that we would have that category with subcategories. A flow chart, what makes it unique is that we will go from point A to point B, from point B to point A, and it shows those steps in between. Now, for the vertical hierarchy, what makes it unique is that order. What makes it unique is the order. We can have a primary, secondary, tertiary, and so on and so forth. So think about our flow chart earlier. But in this case, instead of being a simple flow chart, you can think about A vertical hierarchy is a way, I should say, to organize this flow chart. This is particularly useful to illustrate, for example, good mental maps. Here's an illustration of a vertical hierarchy. So notice that we have long-term memory at the top. So we can think about it as our primary factor. Now, long-term memory could be later established in an order because we have explicit memory and we also have implicit memory within that long-term memory. Explicit memory simply means something that you can declare, right? So if I ask you, what's the capital of the United States? What's your social security number, right? Not that you would want to give me your social security number, right? But notice that this is something you can't declare. Implicit memory, on the other hand, it's generally something that we will recall, but we're not necessarily going to declare it. It's not something that it's easily declared. So for instance, think about first aid procedure that you may do. So for example, driving a car. Right? You have memory as to how to drive a car. You know, you put in the key, you turn the key, shift the gears, release the emergency brake. So notice that you do have long-term memory as to how to drive a car, but you're not declaring that. You're not saying, right now I'm going to put the key in the ignition and then I'm going to move and crank it. And so you're not going to necessarily illustrate that process. You're not going to declare that process. And if we keep thinking about our hierarchy, notice that this would be our second factor in order, right? Because if you recall, that's one of the most important factors of a vertical hierarchy. And lastly, we have our third level. In this third level, we have episodic memory, semantic memory within the explicit memory. So you can tell me about events, things that you have experienced. That's what episodic memory is. So for example, if I asked you, what happened the day of the incident? Or what happened when your parents divorced, right? Something you may say in therapy. That person can tell you what happened. Mom left the house, they sold the house, dad went to Colorado. So those are episodes that you recall. Almost like something you would watch on Netflix or Hulu. You can't recall the episodes. You can recall exactly what happened. On the other hand, we have our semantic knowledge. That's another form of explicit memory. And you can illustrate the processes of something that occur. Knowledge and concept of things. For example, what I am doing right now, illustrating things that are in my long-term memory by declaring them here in class. Basically, the knowledge that I have about these topics. And in our third level, within the implicit memory, notice that we have procedural memory. And here we can think once again of driving a vehicle, how you ride a bike. These are the skills and actions that you have. If you're an artist, the procedures that you engage in, the strokes that you do in a painting. If you're a nurse, the procedures that go into, for example, giving an IV to someone. But notice that when you're doing these things, you're not actually declaring these things. They are implicit. They stay within your own concept. You're not declaring it to somebody else. And the last thing would be emotional conditioning. And something that I like to think about with emotional conditioning is think about when you met your current partner or your ex-partner, right? So if I asked you, think about that first date that you have with that individual. Right? For those of you who are still in love and care about their partner, you can say that first date was amazing. We had a great time. We went to the movies, we went out to eat. So notice that you have been emotionally conditioned to think that this date was amazing because you still love each other. Whereas if you guys broke up, you would say that movie was awful. I hated that first date. I didn't like the food. He or she was really rude, right? So notice how you have been indeed conditioned by something that it's not implicit. By something that is implicit, I should say, but not declarative. Right? For example, your breakup. How you feel about that breakup. Now, another example that I would like to illustrate is the appraisal process. Now, this is another way that we can use a model of hierarchy. So in the appraisal process, what we mean is that we're going to be given a stressor, right? Whatever the stressor may be, i.e. you have an exam tomorrow, right? That will be a huge stressor, right? Thinking you have an exam tomorrow, thinking that your partner has issued a divorce paper. Now, something that would happen is you will assess this threat. Is this a threat or is this a challenge, right? Some of you, if you hear you have a test tomorrow, some of you may say, let's do it. I got this. I can do really well in this test. I've been studying, I'm ready. And some of you may perceive it as a threat. Well, that's the primary appraisal. That's generally that first reaction of hearing or becoming aware, being exposed to that stressor. And with a challenge, we always see a potential gain. Whereas with threat, we generally see negative consequences. Notice that here, just like in our hierarchy, we have a primary, secondary, and third. So when you appraise this stressor a second time, you may evaluate effective options to deal with this threat, and therefore you're going to appraise it as low, or you may have ineffective ways to address this threat, and now you will clearly perceive this stressor as a high threat. This is another really good example of a vertical hierarchy model. Now, similarly, we had our vertical model, I should say, but we also have a horizontal hierarchy model. In this case, the hierarchy, that order, may not necessarily be the focus. Right? So one is not going to supersede the other necessarily. That is not the main focus, right? So for instance, let's think about ranks, right, in the military. A colonel will be higher than a captain will be higher than a lieutenant is higher than a sergeant. And that would work really well for our vertical model that we illustrated earlier because order is much more relevant. The hierarchy is much more relevant, whereas here it's not the main focus. The idea in the horizontal hierarchy is to simply have these categories in a more equal manner. So let's give you an example of that horizontal factor. So notice that we may have biological causes or negative life experiences that can lead to depression. At the same time, depression can also lead to social rejection. So for instance, you may say, well, I asked my friends to go out and hang out with me at the movies, but you were rejected, which in turn is later going to lead to these negative life experiences. And in turn, that leads to more depression, generally when we are sad. And generally people wouldn't want to hang out with a Debbie Downer. That's going to lead to another social rejection. So notice how the order is present, just like in other hierarchies. But notice that that rank, that hierarchy is not necessarily. Now, our next model is the pyramid model. And here, what we have, the main objective of this pyramid model is that there is a proper ultimate outcome at the top. So notice that here, we do have some sort of ultimate goal that we would like to reach. Generally, this would include at least 3 components to illustrate that pyramid. You're going to find one of the most famous hierarchies or triangles is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And in this hierarchy, it will be beyond the scope of this class to go within each factor specifically. But overall, since I noted that there is an upper element generally attributed to the pyramid, I want you to notice that we have all these separate categories, right? We have all these separate categories here. And each one, what it is illustrating is that this lower tier has to be met in order for us to move to the next tier. Once this tier is met, we can move on to our next tier. Once this tier is met, we can move to the next tier. Something I need to remind you of is that in this triangle model, individuals may not necessarily reach that upper level. So for instance, if you don't have food, shelter, and water, chances are the tier of security is not going to be met because the previous one has to be met in order for the next tier, in order for us to reach that next tier, I should say. Notice if we don't have safety, it will be immensely difficult for us to have a sense of intimacy, being able to communicate well and intimately with others, a sense of belonging in a social sense. So if I don't have safety, if I live in an immensely dangerous neighborhood, if I'm not safe in my home, chances are that I won't be able to reach this next factor, which would be self-worth, feeling accomplished, feeling confident. So notice that in a triangular model, you would need the previous tier to be satisfied in order to move to the next. The last model, one of the last models that I would like to discuss is composites. So what you're going to notice is all of the previous ones that we talked about. So for example, the Venn diagram, the flow chart, the hierarchy, the vertical hierarchy, the horizontal hierarchy, the triangle. You're going to find that all these models are going to be present in one model. Generally, the shapes are color-coded. And they'll try to use color-coded lines. Something really interesting is that all of these images are going to be superimposed with one another, right? So you're going to have that flow chart superposed with a Venn diagram and the rest of the models. Color-coded shapes allow us to distinguish between different elements. So there is a purpose of these shapes to have different colors. We may also utilize positive or negative symbols, I should say. And positive and negative symbols are generally utilized to distinguish an outcome. Some of the models that you'll be exposed to that are generally composites are biological models. And interestingly, here in psychology, we have set models. So for example, neurotransmission. In neurotransmission, we will have the presynaptic terminal. And notice how here you have the flow chart, which is going to go directly as a flow chart, the action potential. So the electricity that is coming through the neuron that will open sodium and potassium relationship. Notice that in turn, you still have this flow chart. And now it illustrates a synaptic vesicle. So think about your Venn diagrams, which neurotransmitters are included here. Later, that flow chart is going to take me to a docking protein, which in turn is going to continue with our flow chart here. It's going to release that neurotransmitter. Once that release occurs, those neurotransmitters are going to fit in that receptor to the post-synaptic cell, the next neuron, and the process may repeat itself. So notice that we have elements of the Venn diagram here. Notice that we have hierarchy, right? So for example, one must occur before the other. So we have that this event will precede the next. This will be the end of the presentation when it comes to our models. I sincerely hope that this experience helped you understand the different models that we can utilize in order to describe multiple factors of things that have come to our understanding. Thank you very much for your attention.